The winter wind howled through the empty streets of Boston as Margaret Wilson pulled into her driveway, headlights illuminating a figure huddled against her garage door. Most people would have called the police immediately, especially in Oak Ridge Estates where undesirables were swiftly removed. But something in the man's eyes spoke of dignity fallen on hard times. One act of compassion would set in motion a chain of events no one could have predicted. As the Wealthy Homeowners Association president discovered her violation the next morning, Margaret had no idea that Charles Remington III wasn't just a homeless stranger but a millionaire real estate developer with a secret mission to expose the corruption that had been destroying lives in communities across Massachusetts. Would you risk everything to help a stranger when the system is designed to punish those who show compassion? Margaret Wilson had always been the kind of person who blended into the background. At 35, her shoulder-length blonde hair was usually pulled back in a practical ponytail, her wardrobe consisting mostly of sensible sweaters and comfortable slacks that suited her fourth-grade teaching position at Brookline Elementary. There was nothing particularly remarkable about her appearance, no striking features that would turn heads, no fashion choices that would draw attention. And that was exactly how she preferred it, especially since moving to Oak Ridge Estates 3 years ago after her husband Michael's death. The colonial-style house at the end of Maple Street was smaller than most in the prestigious neighborhood, purchased with Michael's life insurance money as a fresh start. Their wedding photo still occupied the most prominent spot on her mantel, Margaret in a simple white dress, Michael in his army dress uniform, both of them radiating a happiness that seemed to belong to another lifetime. Beside it sat his folded flag, presented to her at Arlington National Cemetery after his unit hit an IED in Afghanistan. The flag was both her most treasured possession and a painful reminder of everything she had lost. The neighbors in Oak Ridge Estates knew very little about Margaret beyond her quiet demeanor and her tendency to spend weekends tending to her meticulously maintained garden. They didn't know about the awards she'd received for educational excellence before moving to Boston, or about the innovative teaching methods she'd once been known for throughout the Virginia school system where she'd started her career. They certainly didn't know that before Michael's death, she had been writing a book on childhood development that publishers had shown significant interest in, a project she'd abandoned in the fog of grief that followed his funeral. To her new neighbors, she was simply the teacher who lived alone, a polite but unremarkable, the kind of person whose name was often forgotten at community gatherings. Behind her quiet exterior, however, Margaret possessed a steel core that had been forged through adversity. The daughter of a single mother who worked 3 jobs to put her through college, she had learned early that the world rarely handed out favors. Her mother's mantra, "Stand your ground, even when you stand alone," had gotten her through the darkest days after Michael's death when the military benefits were delayed and bill collectors called daily. That same quiet determination had helped her navigate the increasingly hostile environment of Oak Ridge Estates, where the Homeowners Association ruled with an iron fist and selective enforcement. Barbara Kensington, the HOA president, seemed to have taken a particular dislike to Margaret from the moment she moved in, scrutinizing her property with a level of attention that bordered on harassment. Yet Margaret had persisted, paying her fines without complaint, adjusting her garden to meet the arbitrary standards, and learning to anticipate the next violation before it could be issued. In her classroom, she was transformed, animated, and engaging, drawing out even the most reluctant learners with her innovative approaches. Her students adored her, parents requested her class, and yet she declined opportunities for advancement or recognition, preferring to remain in the background. Each evening, she returned to her too-quiet house, the silence broken only by classical music playing softly as she graded papers or worked on lesson plans. Occasionally, she would open the locked drawer in her desk where her manuscript gathered dust, run her fingers over the title page, "Nurturing Resilience." Helping children thrive through adversity, then close it again, the weight of unfinished business settling back on her shoulders. Margaret's life had settled into this predictable pattern of quiet days and solitary evenings until that frigid January night when everything changed, when a bearded stranger seeking shelter from a snowstorm would inadvertently set her on a collision course with the power structure that had been making her life miserable for 3 long years. Before moving to Oak Ridge Estates, Margaret Wilson had been someone else entirely. 10 years earlier, she had been Margaret Colenza, rising star in the field of educational psychology, known for her groundbreaking research on childhood resilience. At 25, she had published articles in prestigious journals, spoken at national conferences, and been recruited by the Department of Education to help develop new guidelines for trauma-informed teaching practices. Colleagues predicted she would revolutionize how America's educational system approached at-risk children. She had been fearless, then challenging entrenched methodologies, advocating for students others had given up on, pushing against bureaucratic resistance with unwavering conviction. Her work had attracted attention from major foundations, including a substantial grant to expand her research nationwide. That was when she met Michael Wilson, a military psychologist who shared her passion for helping children overcome adversity. They married after a whirlwind romance, with Margaret continuing her research, while Michael deployed for what should have been his final tour in Afghanistan. The future seemed limitless until the military chaplain and notification officer appeared at her door one rainy Tuesday afternoon. Michael's death shattered her world. The confident, outspoken advocate disappeared overnight, replaced by a woman struggling simply to get through each day. Grief counseling helped marginally, but something fundamental had changed. The passion that had driven her research, the belief that resilience could be taught, that trauma could be overcome, suddenly felt like hollow theory in the face of her own inability to move forward. When the Department of Defense mishandled Michael's benefits, leaving her financially vulnerable, she faced another blow. Senior officials who had once praised her work suddenly became unavailable. Colleagues who had championed her research stepped back, uncomfortable with her raw grief. The educational foundation that had funded her research reprioritized their initiatives, effectively canceling her grant. It wasn't just abandonment, it felt like erasure. Her previous identity, the respected researcher, the passionate advocate, was systematically dismantled. The final straw came when her research was published without proper attribution in a departmental white paper. When she confronted the authors, she was told that her emotional state made her an unreliable narrator of her own work. The betrayal was complete. She sold their small Washington, D.C. apartment, packed what remained of their life together, and disappeared. Using her maiden name professionally, she accepted a teaching position in Boston, a deliberate step down from her previous prominence. She purchased the modest house in Oak Ridge Estates, believing the quiet community would provide the anonymity she craved. The only physical reminder of her former life was a framed certificate hidden in her closet, the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers, presented to her at the White House just weeks before Michael's death. Sometimes, late at night, she would take it out, trace the embossed presidential seal with her fingertips, then return it to its hiding place, unwilling to display an artifact from a life that no longer felt like her own. In the 3 years since arriving at Oak Ridge Estates, Margaret had carefully constructed a new identity, competent but unremarkable, pleasant but forgettable. She avoided professional conferences, declined invitations to speak at educational forums, and redirected conversations whenever former colleagues reached out. She had become a ghost of her former self, and that was precisely her intention. The transformation of Margaret Wilson from respected academic to anonymous suburban teacher might have remained permanent if not for Barbara Kensington and her increasingly dictatorial control over Oak Ridge Estates. Barbara Kensington considered herself the savior of Oak Ridge Estates. When she and her husband Vernon had purchased their 5-bedroom colonial a decade earlier, property values had been stagnating due to what she called insufficient community standards. Within 6 months of joining the HOA board, she had orchestrated a coup against the previous president, whom she deemed criminally permissive. Under her leadership, the HOA handbook expanded from 30 pages to 147, covering everything from acceptable garden gnome dimensions to the precise shade of white permitted for window trim. Every violation provided revenue through fines, which Barbara insisted were necessary for maintaining the character and value of our exclusive community. The fact that her husband's property management company received the majority of maintenance contracts was, in her view, simply efficient business practice. The fact that their daughter's landscaping firm had exclusive rights to service the community was merely supporting family enterprise. The fact that homes of residents who challenged her were mysteriously targeted for multiple violations until they sold often to business associates of her husband at below-market prices was pure coincidence. Barbara ruled Oak Ridge Estates like a feudal lord, surrounded by vassals who benefited from her favor and serfs who learned to keep their heads down. Margaret Wilson fell decidedly into the latter category, nobody who had somehow managed to afford a house in their prestigious community. From the moment Margaret moved in, Barbara seemed determined to establish dominance. The initial violations were minor garbage cans left out too long, incorrect mailbox paint, unauthorized bird feeders. Margaret paid the fines without protest, hoping to avoid conflict. But as months passed, the violations became more frequent and absurd. Her garden beds were 2 inches wider than regulations permitted. Her holiday decorations included unapproved color schemes. The American flag she displayed in memory of Michael was mounted with the wrong type of bracket. Each infraction came with increasing fines and condescending notes about community standards. Other homeowners experienced similar treatment, but Barbara seemed to take particular pleasure in targeting Margaret. At monthly HOA meetings, Margaret watched in silent dismay as Barbara and her hand-picked board members rubber-stamped decisions that benefited their own interests. Maintenance contracts were awarded to companies owned by board members' relatives. Special exemptions were granted to friends while strict enforcement fell on those outside the inner circle. When Margaret finally gathered the courage to question the bidding process for landscaping services, Barbara publicly humiliated her, suggesting that perhaps a schoolteacher shouldn't concern herself with matters beyond her comprehension. The room had fallen silent, other homeowners avoiding eye contact, unwilling to align themselves with someone who had dared challenge the established order. It was in that moment, feeling the familiar sting of institutional betrayal, that something within Margaret began to awaken a dormant sense of injustice that had once fueled her academic research. She began documenting the HOA's selective enforcement, quietly collecting evidence of discrepancies between written regulations and actual practice. She recorded meetings on her phone, photographed violations that went unpunished on board members' properties, and carefully archived every communication related to her own alleged infractions. The teacher's methodical mind that had once analyzed complex data patterns in childhood development studies was now turned toward uncovering patterns of corruption in her own community. The emergency meeting Barbara convened after spotting the homeless man leaving Margaret's garage took place in her expansive living room, with the 6 other board members arranged on furniture selected to keep them slightly lower than Barbara's preferred armchair. The walls were decorated with framed HOA compliance certificates and photographs of Barbara with various local politicians at charity functions. "What we're dealing with," Barbara announced without preamble, "is a direct threat to everything we've built here at Oak Ridge." She passed around printed screenshots from her morning confrontation with Margaret. "Wilson has turned her property into a homeless shelter, in blatant violation of our most fundamental residency restrictions." Vernon Kensington, a florid-faced man whose real estate business had flourished under his wife's HOA leadership, nodded gravely. "This opens us up to all sorts of liabilities. Property damage, criminal activity, reduced home values." Helen Martins, the board secretary who seldom questioned Barbara's decisions, clutched her pearls. What if he had broken into homes? What about our children? Only Richard Greenfield, the newest board member, seemed hesitant. "It was -15 degrees last night, with the wind chill. The shelters downtown were probably full." Barbara's gaze snapped to him. "Are you suggesting we selectively enforce our regulations based on weather conditions?" Her tone made it clear this was not a question that required an answer. What no one at the meeting realized was that Charles, the supposedly homeless man at the center of the controversy, was at that very moment sitting in a penthouse office overlooking Boston Harbor, reviewing surveillance footage of the morning's confrontation captured by cameras he had discreetly placed on his clothing. Charles Remington III, billionaire real estate developer and philanthropist, leaned back in his leather chair as the recording ended. "We found exactly what we were looking for," he told his executive assistant. "Contact Patricia Caldwell at Caldwell and Martin. Tell her we're ready to proceed with the Oak Ridge case." His assistant nodded, making notes. "And the homeowner who assisted you?" Charles smiled for the first time that day, Margaret Wilson. "Find out everything about her professional background, financial situation, any vulnerabilities the Kensingtons might exploit. She just became the most important person in this operation." When the certified letter arrived 3 days later, Margaret wasn't surprised by the excessive fine or the probationary status that essentially stripped her of normal homeowner privacy rights. What stunned her was the additional clause, stating that any further violations within the 90-day probationary period would result in an accelerated enforcement process, potentially leading to property liens or forced sale. Provisions. Barbara had moved beyond harassment into something that felt dangerously close to extortion. That same evening, Margaret found her garbage cans overturned across her driveway despite having been properly placed for collection. The following morning, an anonymous complaint was filed about excessive noise from her property during school hours when she was demonstrably teaching fourth grade 5 miles away. Each incident was documented with meticulous notes and photographs, added to her growing file of evidence. Margaret began setting up her own security cameras, capturing footage of Barbara's son deliberately walking across her newly seeded lawn section, crushing the special native plant garden she had carefully established with her students as a classroom project. The psychological toll was mounting. Margaret found herself jumping at unexpected sounds, checking and rechecking that every aspect of her property complied with HOA regulations, lying awake listening for potential intruders. The parallel to her post-Washington experience was inescapable once again. An institution was systematically working to erase her presence, to force her retreat from space she had rightfully claimed. The familiar urge to simply surrender, to sell the house and disappear into another anonymous existence, grew stronger each day. Ellen Jacobs provided the only consistent support, sharing her own documentation of similar treatment spanning 5 years. "My Harold started keeping records before he died," the elderly woman confided one evening over tea. "He suspected financial improprieties with the maintenance contracts. After he raised questions at a board meeting, they started finding violations on our property weekly. The stress aggravated his heart condition." Her voice faltered. Barbara knew he was ill. She came by with violation notices the day he returned from cardiac surgery. The revelation that Barbara's harassment might have contributed to Harold Jacobs' death ignited something in Margaret that years of personal targeting had failed to provoke a genuine anger. Not the defensive irritation of someone unjustly accused, but the righteous fury of a witness to systematic cruelty. That night, as a fresh snowfall blanketed the neighborhood in white silence, Margaret sat at her kitchen table staring at the mounting evidence of corruption she had collected. The certified letter from the HOA lay before her, its official language attempting to cloak intimidation in bureaucratic legitimacy. Her hands trembled slightly as she considered her options. She could sell the house, take whatever financial loss was necessary, and disappear again. Start over somewhere new, perhaps in a rural area without HOAs or close neighbors. Retreat further into anonymity, bury her past even deeper. The path of least resistance beckoned with familiar comfort. It was what she had done before, what had provided a measure of peace these past 3 years. As tears threatened, her gaze fell on the kitchen windowsill where a small framed, quote, "stood a gift from Michael on their first anniversary." "Courage doesn't always roar," it read. "Sometimes courage is the quiet voice at the end of the day saying, 'I will try again tomorrow.'" Margaret had kept it as a reminder of him, but in that moment, the words seemed to be speaking directly to her present situation. She opened her laptop and began typing an email to the one person she had deliberately avoided contacting since leaving Washington, her former academic mentor, Patricia Caldwell, who had since transitioned from education policy to law, becoming a founding partner in a prestigious Boston firm. Margaret's hands hovered over the keyboard, doubt creeping in. Reaching out meant reconnecting with her past identity, acknowledging the career and research she had abandoned. It meant becoming visible again. The cursor blinked on the empty message field as she wrestled with her fear. The chime of her phone interrupted her thoughts. A text from Ellen Jacobs, who had also experienced Barbara's targeted harassment. "Saw what happened this morning. Are you okay?" The simple expression of concern from a neighbor who had no obligation to get involved touched something deep within Margaret. She closed her laptop without sending the email, deciding to handle the situation on her own for now. Instead, she retrieved her documentation of HOA violations from the locked desk drawer and began organizing the evidence more systematically. If Barbara wanted war, Margaret would no longer retreat without a fight. She had allowed herself to be erased once before. She would not permit it to happen again. As snow continued falling outside her window, Margaret Wilson made a decision that would alter not just her own future, but the future of an entire community. She would stand her ground even if she stood alone. The elegant conference room on the 32nd floor of Boston's prestigious Hancock Tower was not what Margaret had expected for an initial legal consultation. The sweeping views of the harbor, the gleaming mahogany table, the original artwork on the wall saw suggested high-powered corporate litigation rather than a homeowner dispute. When Patricia Caldwell entered, Margaret momentarily froze, transported back a decade to Department of Education conferences where her former mentor had championed her research. Patricia's trademark silver bob and impeccable tailoring were unchanged, though fine lines around her eyes marked the passage of time. Margaret Collins Wilson, Patricia said, using both names in a way that acknowledged their shared history. It's been far too long. Before Margaret could respond, the door opened again, admitting two Millionaire carrying a laptop, the other instantly recognizable, despite his now clean-shaven appearance and tailored suit. Charles, Margaret gasped, the homeless man from her garage now transformed into what was clearly an executive. I believe I owe you an explanation, he said with a smile that transformed his serious features. And perhaps an apology for my deception. Over the next hour, Charles Remington III explained that he was the founder of Urban Housing Justice Initiative, an organization that investigated predatory housing practices nationwide. His homeless research involved personally experiencing how different communities responded to housing vulnerability. Most neighborhoods show basic humanity, he explained. They direct people to shelters, sometimes offer temporary assistance. Oak Ridge Estates was uniquely hostile, was reported by 7 different homeowners in one evening, following explicit board directives about undesirables. Margaret listened in stunned silence as Charles and Patricia outlined what they had uncovered about the Kensington's operation, financial fraud, racketeering, targeted harassment driving down property values so insider associates could purchase at below-market rates. The laptop-carrying man, introduced as a forensic accountant, displayed spreadsheets showing HOA funds systematically diverted to Kensington-controlled companies. We've been building this case for 18 months, Patricia explained. But we needed a current homeowner willing to be the plaintiff of record. When Charles reported his interaction with you, we investigated your background. She slid a folder across the table. Inside was a comprehensive dossier on Margaret's former academic career, her publications, awards, presentations. You weren't just any educator, Margaret. You were revolutionizing how we approach childhood resilience before you disappeared. The explicit reference to her abandoned career made Margaret flinch. That was another lifetime, she said quietly. I'm just a teacher now. Charles leaned forward, his expression earnest. That's precisely why you're perfect for this fight. You understand institutional power dynamics. You've documented evidence meticulously. And most importantly, you recognize the impact of systemic injustice on vulnerable populations. Patricia added, the Kensingtons aren't just annoying neighbors, Margaret. They've destroyed lives. Harold Jacobs wasn't their only victim. We've identified 11 homeowners forced out of their properties in the past 5 years, many elderly or financially vulnerable. The moral weight of the situation settled on Margaret's shoulders. This wasn't just about her harassment anymore. It was about a community under siege, from predators exploiting their positions of authority, the very dynamics she had once studied and fought against professionally. What exactly would my involvement entail? She asked, her academic precision returning as she processed the information. We file a RICO case against the board members personally, Patricia explained. You would be the primary plaintiff, with others joining once the case is public. We have the evidence to seek emergency injunctive relief immediately, halting their enforcement actions while the case proceeds. The quarterly HOA meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. in the Oak Ridge Estates clubhouse, a Tudor-style building that Barbara often described as reminiscent of authentic English country estates, despite being constructed in 1998. Homeowners filed in reluctantly, taking seats in the uncomfortable folding chairs arranged to face the raised platform where board members sat at a long table, Barbara's chair noticeably taller than the others. Margaret arrived early, selecting a seat beside Ellen Jacobs in the center of the room. Barbara's gaze tracked her entry, a slight smirk playing at the corners of her mouth as she shuffled papers importantly. The meeting proceeded with excruciating formality minutes read aloud in full despite being previously distributed, committee reports delivered with unnecessary detail, Barbara interrupting frequently to emphasize her personal contributions to various initiatives. When the financial report began, Margaret noticed Barbara's sudden acceleration through the material, glossing over maintenance expenditures with vague references to necessary seasonal adjustments and standard contractual increases. Are there any questions about the financial report? Barbara asked perfunctorily, already reaching for the next agenda item. Yes, I have several, Margaret stated, rising from her seat. The room fell silent, though moaners weren't accustomed to anyone challenging Barbara directly, especially not the quiet teacher who rarely spoke at meetings. Barbara's professional smile tightened. Mrs. Wilson, we have a full agenda tonight. Perhaps you could submit your questions in writing for next month's meeting. I'm afraid these questions can't wait another month, Margaret replied evenly. Particularly the question about why maintenance contracts weren't put out for competitive bidding as required by our bylaws. Barbara's husband shifted uncomfortably in his seat at the board table. Those decisions are at the board's discretion, Barbara snapped. Actually, they're not, came a voice from the back of the room. Charles walked in, followed by Patricia Caldwell and two uniformed police officers. The bylaws explicitly require competitive bidding for any contract over $10,000. Barbara's face flushed. This is a private meeting. You need to leave immediately. Patricia stepped forward. I'm Patricia Caldwell, representing several Oak Ridge homeowners, including Mrs. Wilson. We filed a civil RICO case against the board this afternoon, and these officers are here to serve you with papers. She nodded to the officers, who moved forward with documents. The room erupted in confused murmurs as Barbara sputtered protests. Her husband attempted to leave, but was stopped by one of the officers. The court has issued a temporary restraining order freezing HOA accounts pending appointment of a receiver, Patricia continued, her voice cutting through the chaos. The judge has also ordered preservation of all records. Charles addressed the stunned homeowners. My name is Charles Remington. I'm a real estate developer who's been investigating predatory HOA practices across Massachusetts. What's happening at Oak Ridge isn't just unethical, our evidence suggests it's criminal. Margaret stood and faced her neighbors. For 3 years, I've watched this board selectively enforce rules, harass homeowners who ask questions, and drive people from their homes. Last month, they placed a fraudulent lien on my property for allowing a man to shelter in my garage during a snowstorm, a man who turned out to be Mr. Remington, conducting research on housing discrimination. Ellen rose beside her, her voice shaking but determined. They've been doing this for years. My husband tried to stop them before he died. He kept records I've now provided to the attorneys. Jason Chen, a surgeon who had also experienced targeted harassment, joined them. They cited me for parking violations when I returned from emergency surgeries, but ignored the same violations by board members and their friends. One by one, homeowners stood to share their experiences as Barbara and her board members sat in stunned silence. The police officers remained by the exits, ensuring no one attempted to leave with documents. The most damning evidence came when Charles's forensic accountant connected his laptop to the projector and displayed the HOA's actual financial records alongside maintenance contracts. The HOA has been overcharged approximately $230,000 annually for services provided by companies owned by board members or their families, he explained, highlighting specific transactions. No competitive bids were solicited, and invoices showed charges for services never performed. Barbara finally found her voice. This is slander. You have no right to access private financial records. Actually, Patricia countered, under Massachusetts law, all homeowners have the right to examine HOA records. When Mrs. Wilson requested these documents, you denied her access, another violation of state law. The aftermath unfolded more dramatically than anyone anticipated. The forensic audit revealed over $2 million in misappropriated funds spanning 12 years. The district attorney's investigation uncovered evidence of multiple felonies, falsified records, mail fraud, wire fraud, and kickback schemes involving city officials who had overlooked building code violations at properties owned by the Kensingtons. Barbara and her husband were arrested 3 weeks after the confrontation, along with the HOA treasurer and 2 city inspectors. They currently await trial on 27 criminal counts, with prosecutors suggesting sentences of 15 to 20 years were likely given the extent of the fraud. Under Charles's receivership, the community transformed rapidly. A provisional board was established with term limits and transparency requirements. Maintenance contracts were rebid, reducing monthly dues by nearly 30% while improving services. The clubhouse and pool, which had fallen into disrepair despite high maintenance fees, were properly renovated. Most satisfying was watching the community heal. Neighbors who had kept to themselves for years began organizing social events. Gardens flourished without fear of arbitrary violations. Ellen's granddaughter moved in with her, something previously forbidden by Barbara's selective enforcement of single-family dwelling requirements. As for Margaret, she was unanimously elected to the new permanent board 6 months later, despite never seeking the position. Her fellow homeowners insisted her classroom management skills were exactly what the community needed after years of dysfunction. Charles's company established a foundation to help other communities identify and address predatory HOA practices, using Oak Ridge as a case study. The legal precedents established by their case have already helped homeowners in 3 other Massachusetts communities challenge corrupt boards. Last week, Margaret received a letter from the district attorney's office confirming that all liens and violations issued by the previous board had been officially nullified. With it was a personal note from Charles: kindness shown to a stranger revealed your character. Courage shown to a community revealed your leadership. Oak Ridge is fortunate to have you. Yesterday, Ellen and Margaret planted a community garden in what had previously been an unused corner of the property, something Barbara had rejected for years as unsightly. As they worked alongside neighbors who had once been strangers, Margaret realized that true communities aren't built on rules and enforcement, but on compassion and shared purpose. The Oak Ridge Estates sign at their entrance now bears a new motto, voted on by residents: where neighbors become family. It's a daily reminder that standing up to Yevon in its most mundane forms is always worth the risk. Some battles are won not with power but with dignity. If you were in her position, would you have found the courage to fight, or would you have walked away?